You can call me Chitonge, I prefer that. I work at UCT, at the Center for African Studies. And my main research focuses around issues of water, but I also work on the alternative for Africa's, for economic growth in Africa. Of late, I've been reflecting around issues of, smart industries that do not cause a lot of harm to the living earth. And so I don't have a big presentation, as it were. I just have a few points to reflect on, because when I was asked to speak, I was asked to speak about the experience of learning and also teaching, economics with students. So I don't teach mainstream economics. I do teach a bit of development economics, but development theory as well. So what I'm going to speak about, just a few general points out of my experience in this. And I would like to start with a quotation from one of the, one of the scholars who has done actually a tremendous amount of work on the economy and the environment, and that's David Cotton. And this is what he says. He says that our most prestigious universities continue to teach economic principles that empower corporations, and they do this in the service of money. And this results in the destruction of Earth's capacity to sustain life. This also leaves many in desperation, and thus drives humanity to self-extinction. He goes on to say that an economics of the 21st century will guide us to an economy that empowers people and in the service of life. Which to me, so when and the reason why I'm starting with that is that it embodies a kind of a mental shift that we are all invited, or that we are all supposed to make as a result of where we find ourselves. So it's not just a changing, the economic system, it's also changing the way of thinking. And I think that's what I would like to share, that for us to imagine a world where we live, at peace with the earth, at peace with each other, at peace as people who are interconnected by our relations to earth. We will have to shift. We have to make a big shift from where we are at the moment. And this might require just not dismantling or finding alternatives to capitalism, but a complete shift in terms of thinking, in terms of the way we organize society. And that shift has to be rooted in the choices we make. And I would want to start with the point that much of our life on this planet constructed around choices that we make, and the choices that we make they're cultural. They're not just in economic. They're cultural choices. They're institutional choices. They're technological. The technology that we bring out is also embedded in a particular way of thinking, and the shift that that our current crisis requires us to make, would require to make even the kinds of technology that we come up with, the kinds of infrastructural choices that we make, whether it's in the city or in the countryside. I make that point to emphasize the point that we can actually make choices to change. So change is not changing the way we relate to the earth. For instance, is a choice that can be made. But it's choices that can be made at an individual level, but more effective choices have to be made at an institutional level, perhaps at a global level. And that's where it becomes a bit more difficult because people have different views. You've heard people saying that climate change, is not caused by global warming and contesting the science when other people would say that actually there is overwhelming evidence that what we are doing to the planet is what is causing the experience and the crisis that we find ourselves in. But then fundamentally, this would also require that because part of the bigger picture here is that our economic ideas influence our choices, influence our activities, influence our relations. So part of this rethinking would also require the rethinking of the economics, because the ideas there are they're very powerful, if I may use that term, in the sense that they influence decisions that are made by politicians, they influence decisions that are made by scientists, they influence decisions that are made by, the larger, broader, decision makers. And so we need to begin to rethink that. And rethinking that, of course, would require that we begin to rethink the economics curriculum so that it reflects on the shifts that we need to make. At the moment, we're still carrying on with the teaching of the curriculum as if as if things were normal. But we're seeing that things are actually not as normal as we were even 20 or 30 years ago. So we would need a curriculum that factors into the economics program issues of inequality, for instance. And I was just speaking to some of the students the other day, and they were saying that in a normal economics program, economics, poverty, climate change are mentioned on the side. And I think that we need to change that so that those three key ideas become central to what we teach and to what we learn in economics. And part of the thinking there, just to use an example, is to think of, and this is an issue that perhaps has been discussed already, of how we think about the economy. The economy is thought in terms of GDP. But it's GDP, of course, what is GDP? GDP in simple terms is the value that is added, but value added from what to what? And so those ideas need to be critically engaged to make sure that when we're speaking about GDP as value added, we are also speaking about the opposite of that, that to add value, it has to be taken from somewhere. So how much value have we taken from nature? In other words, natural wealth. How much natural wealth have we taken to create this value that we have added, which we are counting as GDP? For instance, I was just looking at the numbers. South Africa's GDP, about 3.8 trillion rand. If we see, so the rethinking that should happen is that how much did we use to create that value? How much did we use to add that value? And how much we use is not just the intermediates that went into the production, but other things that are not even visible. For instance, how many tons of pollution did we put into the environment to produce that value added? And so what our national accounting system is only one-sided. It only gives us the value produced. Well, it does take into account that, but they are invisible. There's invisible value that is perhaps even destroyed. And if we were to balance the accounting system, we might actually see that we are actually destroying more than what we are adding to. And that's where the rethinking, I think, once we begin to think in those terms, it's possible to rethink the way we do our economics. And so people are beginning to talk about the green GDP, which emphasizes more about well-being. Again, it goes back to the earlier point I was making, that our economics should emphasize on issues of inequality. What's happening to people? If we are generating so much wealth, where is it going? What is it doing? Is you know, before we even get to the environment, what just in terms of how we are distributing the wealth that's being generated. We've had, you know, estimates saying, you know, the 1% people on the planet and, you know, or on more than the 99% of the people. And that in itself shows that there's a bit of violence that's being done to people, but also to the environment in indirect and indirect ways. So the idea of a green GDP would take into account things of well-being, things of concern with environmental, just not human well-being, but environmental well-being, because the two are actually very interconnected. That if you ignore one, that leaves actually a lot of questions unanswered. So that's, I think, the idea of a transformation. And again, to go back to David Cotton, he has this estimate that is actually quite surprising, quite not surprising, sorry, that currently what we are consuming 1.7 times the rate at which we are consuming. That's the aggregate rate. Of course, some people consume very little of that, but we're consuming 1.7 times the Earth's capacity to regenerate the systems that can support life. In other words, we are consuming 70% more than what is sustainable. And that in itself is a warning that we are already reaching levels that are highly, highly unsustainable. And the paradox of this is that a large number of people actually still can't meet basic needs. And I think the rethinking needs to go. So just to end, then how do we then engineer the rethinking? Because there are a lot of people, there are some people who reflect on it, but some people this doesn't make any sense. And I think I go here to Joseph Stiglitz, who suggests that actually it's important for us to make the shift. It's important to, education can actually be the way that we train people. It's education, you know, it's in just the formal sense, but education in the sense of making information available and helping people. And it singles out particularly that graduate students would be, because they're the next, you know, they're transitioning in the next generation of policymakers. So that we could actually have an impact if we begin to ask them to reflect more radically on those points. And I think that my experience also of teaching, you know, postgraduate students, both in terms of the classroom but also research, is that there are positive signs in the sense that a lot more younger people are beginning to reflect on this. They are not just saying, "Look, I want to, you know, go on and consume as much." They're beginning to think, and I think the opportunity is great there for those of us who are engaged in the industry of teaching. I'll end there for now. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Horman. That was great. An excellent start to this. And I'm sure that there'll be lots of questions coming up. So we'll go to our second speaker in the session now. That is Michelle, present. I just realized I didn't check if I was pronouncing your surname correctly when we spoke. So Michelle, please correct me if I'm wrong. And Michelle will just give a brief introduction of herself and then go into her presentation. And just a reminder, please post your questions in the chats.
Thanks, everyone. Lovely to be here and lovely to share the platform with Chitonge, my colleague at the university. And also nice to see Sergio that took my course last year on society and natural resources. So just briefly, I'm sort of very new to academia. For 20 years or so, I worked mostly for NGOs in environmental justice and did a small stint in government during the World Summit on Sustainable Development. So in the area around responding to or trying to respond to environmental crises for a very long time, but you can see making matters worse. So I'm wondering if one of you can to kind of worry about it, and then I'll just tell you which slide to move to. Is that okay, Caroline? Carolee?
That's fine. That's fine, Michelle. Thank you. We are losing you a little bit, so I don't know if we maybe want to turn the video off. It is sort of going in and out.
Okay, let me. My internet is. I'm using my iPhone because my Wi-Fi has been cutting off, so it's windy in Woodstock. And maybe I'll just also put on my earphones.
That's perfect. Now we can find it. Was just a little bit funny earlier. So maybe if we just turn the video off, it'll be fine. And then everyone, just to see, Nsako has put the link to Michelle's presentation in the chat so that you can open that up.
Okay, but can you open it on the screen? Or...
Oh, yes, sorry. Yes, I can.
Okay.
And I can share my screen, yes.
Okay, thanks.
That was when you were cutting out, I think, that I didn't hear.
Okay, thanks. All right, I've got my earphones on now, so the sound should be clearer. Right, so just the first slide, thanks. So, yes, I'm how we as humanity place of deepening social and ecological crises. And so in my own research, I'm thinking or deeply thinking about the depths of coloniality and how it played a role in putting nature to work for capital accumulation. So I think that changing curricula imperative to include the historical construction of a normative society and ask questions and deeply interrogate we got ourselves into the situation. And often we hear the term the new normal, but I also think we deeply need to interrogate that people living on this earth have not really been living normal lives in the first place. And that the royal we that are part of the society, this constructed society, are the people that have become subjugated to colonialist and modernist way of being and knowing. So earlier referred to James become, and so I'm going to say in the second slide, the slide with feudalism. One up, please. This is not quite working. Thanks. To the feudalism slide. Thanks. You can just stay there. I'll tell you when to move. Okay. And let me just do a time check. All right. So important question is how the world became a capitalist web of life that put the whole of nature to work for capital. So both human nature and nature, the non-human worlds and non-living entities. So part of the of how we got here is that the ongoing condition of turning human activity into labor power and land into property was a symbolic knowledge regime premised on alienation. So the job of science was to make nature legible for capital accumulation and thereby transferring work for the accumulation of capital and empire. The job of economy was channeling this alienation through the cash nexus. And the job of the state was to enforce the cash nexus. And as Moyo states, he says to be sure that the separation from nature was illusionary, humans could never escape nature, but the terms of the relations did change. And those changing terms of humanity nature was bundled into the symbolic notions of creating a world praxis in the image of capital, or he says rather the fantasies of capital. And this knowledge was premises on. Some of you maybe study philosophy would know that Cartesian dualism is critical to this kind of separation, the mathematizing and the aggregation of nature into units. So how this is situated in a way of being and thinking of knowledge were puts into sort of three procedures that shape the modern world. The first is the imposition of the ontological status of entities and substances as opposed to relationships. That is, energy, matter, people, ideas became things, and again, things to be extracted. Also, the centrality of this logic is about either or rather than both and. And you'll know in many policy decisions, there'll be the notions of trade, or I worked in government in the Sustainable Development Unit, and always be the sort of trade-off between the economic argument or the business model, versus the social aspects and the environmental aspects. And so in many ways, that's how our decision making is shaped. And the third aspect is the idea of purposes, control over nature through applied science and the idea of human mastery. And so part of the human and master nature through our to be troubled. So I'm still on the slide, and I just want to go into a little bit more deeper into history and refer to a scholar called William Cronin, who talks about the changes of the land in New England during the 1600s and 1800s, when the Europeans arrived there. And he points out, when the Europeans first arrived to New England, they found a world that has been home to the Indian people for over 10,000 years. The part from the Europeans who were accustomed to other ways of interacting with the environment. The contestations revealed not only land and ecological systems between the Indians and the colonists, a fundamental ontological difference. Cronin asserts that when the colonists saw the land of plenty and sought merchantable commodities, but what they were seeing is landscapes in terms of commodities meant something very different. They treated members of the ecosystems as isolated resources, that is a term that needs we see nature as natural resource. You mentioned that Moore highlights that Cartesian dualism is a key source of the problem that practically we bind up in the thinking of the world ontologically on what is, and epistemologically, how we know that is centered on Cartesian dualism. I want to say that also a key aspect about the separation is that this set of values began to view the earth as a machine rather than a living organic organism that sanctioned both nature and women. Or heard of Caroline Merchant's book, The Death of Nature, that focuses on this, also the subjugation of women. And that indigenous peoples are also considered as, were not considered as part of humanity or society. So they were designated only parter, and therefore they were sanctioned to exploit, still centered into aspects of race and class and labor relations in South Africa, how our towns are still organized and segregated. And lastly, I want to say here that this historical changes and relations of the modern human and planetary systems change the productive, to this productivist, extractive relations. And for me, often this kind of deep history of how we arrived in this capitalist web of life is often ignored in the sort of Anthropocene and climate mitigation discourse, who in time is primarily looking at green technology as a way of mitigating and addressing climate change. So we can move to the next slide. And this brings me to a critique of green thought. So the problem with green thought that Moore points out that it's centered on environmental consequences of technology. So we kind of blame coal power stations and pollution primarily for the current problem that reveals this kind of apocalypse or collapse. And among this idea is that if we just shut down the steam engines and coal plants while leaving intact the inequalities and their gendered and racialized cosmopologies upon which capitalism depends, all will be well. And so we often hear, and many NGOs in the environmental justice terrain are calling for green energies and renewable energies. And of course, people are concerned about the inequalities, but we also need to take cognizance that the way the kind of economics is organized will maintain those racialized inequalities. And in my own PhD research, looking at renewable transitions or rather alternative to current renewable energy transitions, I reveal more deeply this kind of inequalities, and that's maintained in South Africa's renewable energy program. And I'm working with a community that offered their land for wind turbines. I guess the situation, the shadows of coloniality and violence are totally overlooked. So we can move to the next slide. You can move to the next slide, thanks. So for me, what's striking beyond these normative frameworks, and I think, and we're making demands from governments for justice and inequalities in a system that's not really organized to be just and equal. So it's time for ideas of thinking sort of, beyond different to what's happening now. So one of the aspects is that diverse ideas are required to draw from many ways of knowing and shift epistemic practice. And so the idea of one size fits all or development and progress, I think it's clearly obvious that these types of thinkings, so we need to be asked different questions for different answers. And this will need to illuminate more decolonial and relational approaches. And relational approaches engages the view of sustainability that looks for at ways of and utilitarian relationships we have with both nature and human nature, and fosters relations towards care, restoration, life affirming, and reciprocal ways. So bringing an understanding that our human well-being depends on the well-being of the whole. And I think in this moment of the global COVID-19 pandemic, we as humans will see how fragile we are, and that the way we interact with each other and the earth deeply depends on the well-being of the whole. So this will require change in relationships with ourselves, with others, and the way we relate to so-called nature. So you can go into the 5th slide, and I'm coming to an end now. So this would require a surrender to unlearning. So at our universities, we have to go through a deep process of unlearning the way we've learned, whether it's economics or sociology or in our sciences, and draw from and learning and teaching of the otherwise. And the pedagogies of the otherwise are the many knowledges that were discursively erased during the period of colonialism, and it still sort of sits in the culture box of our current thinking and discourse. And I draw on the idea of borderland thinking from Ansel Duer and and Schultz. And I just want to point out that, part of my own relearning of thinking is sort of thinking beyond political economy, and also ideas of decolonizing even political ecology. So for the idea of border thinking is the idea of dwelling on the borderlands metaphorically, as well as in concrete terms, to create new cultural and political imaginaries. It's a position of in between. And so it's not to say that we must diss completely the Western-centric ideas. We can use what's useful, but that's not the only gig in town. Minolo speaks about the delinking from the primarily Western-centric epistemological frame that silences the subalterns and that makes it the other non-Western voice. As I said, it does not mean that border thinking is anti-scientific, but borrowing from Minolo, it is rather a means for us to practice epistemic disobedience, to direct our thinking, learning, teaching, research to the subject that speaks human and non-human, combining different aspects of ecology and decoloniality with a pluriversal of views to the more than human ontologies or the more than human worlds. So if we accept the idea of border thinking, it will require a heightened sense of enchantment to engage more thoroughly with the mystical narratives, which tells us about ourselves and others with the living and non-living world. And you can see the picture in the slide. It is a picture from Beyond Vivere, that upholds the philosophy of life into a vision of society that subordinates economic objectives to ecological criteria, human dignity, and social justice. The ideas of producing in harmony with nature and producing what's enough, where relationships between ego, the mind, and nature are constructed differently. And these ideas are very similar to the ideas of a person is a person through other people, or we are because you are. And so in a way, we have to come back to the ideas or the pedagogy of thinking of things in relation and the idea of rationality. Thanks.
Great, thank you so much, Michelle. That was wonderful. That was really great. And I'm sure that there'll be a lot of questions and comments coming from that. I know one of the things that when you were talking about extractives and how that can sometimes, you know, whilst we all recognize the need to the need to transition away from fossil fuels, renewables, if done wrong, can replicate these unequal relationships. And there is an academic in the US, Thea Riofrancos, who's done a lot of work on like lithium mining and the way in which we obviously need for batteries and is really important, but the way in which that kind of extractive nature is still coming out, right? And the way in which communities in the areas where this mining happens are still affected. And so the need to kind of think about global value chains as well, and the way in which people at different parts of that value chain are affected by this. So I think this is really important, and I hope we can pick up on some of this a little bit more in the Q&A, which we should have some good time for. So I'm going to turn over quickly now to our third speaker, which is Bruce Bagery. And Bruce is going to come in. I think he's also got a presentation to share. So Bruce, are you ready?
I'm ready.
Thank you.
Let's just do this technical side of things.
Perfect, we can see the screen. And Bruce, it's a little bit, oh, there, perfect, that's perfect.
I should be, give me 1 second. Okay, are we good?
We're good, yeah.
Great. Okay, thanks everyone. So yeah, my name's Bruce. I work for an organization called the AIDC, the Alternative Information and Development Center. And I studied ecology, biological sciences, and conservation. But my post-university life has very much taken me towards much more political side of things. But so the title of my presentation today, I've called it, how do we put out the fire? How are we going to stop the climate crisis? And you would see that I've got ecological crises in brackets. And I think Michelle's presentation just illustrated it. It's so much more than just the climate crisis, but just for time, I'm going to mostly focus in on the issue of the climate crisis and looking at political education and what are the politics and pedagogy that we require to kind of meet the climate crisis. So I want to start off by kind of asking this question: does the world agree that climate change is bad? Well, what does it mean by the world, and what does it mean to agree? But just kind of work with me and think of it, the world as kind of the ruling class, kind of the most powerful people in the world, the people who really have the power to shift things significantly. And I would say that it's been slow going, but mostly, certainly the European Union have been kind of leading the rhetoric and somewhat the action on the climate crisis. And then there was this massive announcement by President Xi Jinping that China, the fastest growing economy in the world, the largest emitter of carbon dioxide or all emissions, is going to try achieve carbon neutrality by 2060. Now, I know there's something I'm not mentioning, and I'm kind of hoping that we won't have to deal with it past November. But I would say on the whole, there's kind of this acceptance among the major powers. There are some notable exceptions that climate change is bad and something needs to be done. Now, there are people who have been waging the struggle for environmental justice, climate justice for a very long time. And they certainly didn't need to be told this by the ruling classes. But I would say, if we take the words of one of these people, Chico Mendes, and he says, you know, at first I thought I was fighting to save rubber trees. Then I thought I was trying to save the Amazon rainforest. And now I realize I'm fighting for humanity. And I would say there's been an uneven but elevation of consciousness across the world, that this is a shared threat, that the climate crisis, the ecological crises are actually a threat to the human species as a whole. But given that there is this rising consciousness, that there's this acceptance by most of the ruling class, the global leaders, things are probably going to be okay, right? And if you would look at some headlines, including in the South African press, you might be tempted to think that, you know, things are not too bad, you know, that the transition to renewable energy is unstoppable. And I kind of want to use renewable energy as a proxy for kind of where we're at with dealing with the climate crisis. But I think we all know that to transition to low carbon economies goes far beyond renewable energy. But I would say transition, what transition? I mean, this is kind of where we're at. And in fact, the number is a little bit less than 26% at the moment. So 26% of the world's electricity production is renewable energy, but about 16% is hydropower. And there are a lot of problems and limitations with hydropower, especially if you're heading into a climate unstable future, where you can't guarantee the same amount of water and rainfall. And this is just electricity production. If we're talking about all energy, so kind of heat, petroleum, then renewables is only about 11%, and 6% of that is hydropower. Okay, so renewable energy is still completely marginal. And then we look at investment, and this is the really scary data. And so you'll see kind of in the mid-2000s, there's this very significant increase in renewable energy, but it's very uneven from then on. You get decreases. Only in 2008, we had a significant decrease, 11%, and only a small recovery in 2019. And to put this in perspective, to meet the most conservative climate targets, we need that gross investment you see in 2019 to double for the next 10 years. So we're talking about 100% increase on what you're seeing in that graph. So we are nowhere close to where we need to be. And we don't even need to look at data like this. We can just kind of look at what's happening around us. The climate crisis is accelerating with devastating consequences. Now, a colleague of mine likes to sum up this contradiction of the global leaders, I would say vast sections of the media would agree that climate change is bad and an urgent issue, but things are only getting worse. You know, emissions are still going up. The climate disasters are accelerating, and as you see by that graph, we're not doing nearly enough to meet it. And he calls it the Greta puzzle. And he likes to use this example of Greta Thunberg going to Davos, the World Economic Forum, speaking in front of the most powerful people in the world. You know, this brave young woman. And she says, you know, the planet is on fire. This crisis is accelerating out of control, and it's your fault. And she says, you know, it's this system that you're kind of promoting, unlimited growth, that is responsible. And what do people do? Well, they stand up and they clap and they cheer and they say, this wonderful, brave girl. But the things still only get worse. So if everyone agrees this is bad, why is it not changing? Well, I think Michelle has kind of touched on it, but you know, on the left, it's a systemic issue. It's one of the system. It's one of capitalism, where capitalism cannot abide a barrier, it cannot slow down, it needs to maximize profits wherever it can. And meaningful developments only come through challenging capitalism. You can't green it, you can't cover up, you can't solve it with kind of more of the same thing, just slightly different, with slightly different technologies. And it's not going to apply the brakes. The system is not going to apply the brakes. It's going to have to come from somewhere else. Something else is going to have to say, enough is enough. We have to really change things. And I like to go back to Chico here, where he says, environmentalism without class struggle is just gardening. Well, fortunately, the youth aren't waiting. And we've seen millions of youth hit the streets over the past few years. And many people don't know that our youth have been doing this as well. And there were some recent actions just the other day under COVID, which was really inspiring. But I would caution again, are we falling into some of the same traps, this kind of false optimism? Because I think there are still a lot of problems. One of them I see is the pervasiveness of individualism, of kind of consumptive choices. And, you know, going vegan and recycling, I would say, are good things. They are ethical things, but they're not solutions. And you can see how the insanity of a company like BP, one of the largest polluters historically and currently, posting a tweet saying, come, you can work out your carbon footprint. This is us trying to help us through all of this. And, you know, still in Cape Town a few years ago, there were these plans to do climate actions, and what people wanted to do were beach cleanups. They wanted to go into places like the townships and pick up litter. Again, these are good things, but they're not really understanding the issue. And there's a huge missed opportunity where to not kind of link these struggles with, let's say, a sanitation struggle. And I think it's important for us to realize what we're up against. And I think this is also sometimes lost. You know, Cyril Ramaphosa mentioned the youth strikers last year in his State of the Nation address, and there was a lot of kind of excitement around that. And it's important to kind of feel that excitement, because it's good to know that you're doing work. But he's also just announced new coal power. And so it's very clear, or it needs to become clear, that nothing short of a momentous struggle is going to deliver us from the climate crisis. And then in South Africa, we have to kind of locate that within a society where people are facing so many issues. And I would say, even if one understands climate change and agrees it's a bad thing, putting bread on the table, avoiding sexual assault are going to often be the primary things you think about. So that I would also say there's wide agreement among climate activists, and what we need are these programs like 1 million climate jobs, which was developed by the organization I work for, things like the Green New Deal by Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, as these are politically appealing to a lot of people. They're going to bring employment, better services, but we still need to think about how we're going to get to these programs. Because once we accept that we need kind of a mass struggle to bring these programs about, we need the politics to develop it. We need the politics to kind of build these movements, this struggle, this resistance. And myself and Carolee actually took a stab at trying to develop or interrogate this question. And we based our article off of an essay called Ecological Politics for the Working Class by Matt Huber in the US. I highly recommend people read this essay, and I'll post the link in the chat. But you know, at the end of the day, we need political education and we need organizing. So for the rest of my presentation, I'd like to talk about what we've done at the AIDC, kind of under the banner of system change, not climate change. And it started with a course last year that we taught to, I would say, about 40 participants. And some of the methods, the pedagogy that we followed were traditional. So it kind of started off with a classic kind of lecture presentation, kind of like this. But, you know, this is necessary. This kind of understanding the science, getting to grips with how global heating works, where emissions come from. These are things that need to be taught. But it's very important to move beyond this. And again, reading groups, fairly traditional method of teaching, but we try to make these very collaborative, ensure that everyone in the group has a chance to read, is encouraged to do so, is helped when they don't necessarily understand. And from there, participants broke into doing some creative work and kind of practically creating what they'd learned. And what came out was absolutely fantastic. And I hope you can notice on the top kind of poster that in the middle there it says deathly versus inconvenient. And this was referring to the heat waves of 2019. And the temperatures were quite similar in the subcontinent in India and Pakistan to those in Europe. But in the subcontinent, it could mean the complete destruction of your livelihood. Whereas in Paris, a lot of people just had a swim in the public fountains. So issues of environmental and climate justice start coming up and are grappled with. Below is an example of kind of the more creative, popular materials that people did. So things they could put up in their schools. You'll see it's in Afrikaans, Xhosa, and English. That's actually my desktop background. I love that poster. And we also got participants to teach this stuff themselves. Okay, so to teach us as facilitators and other participants, and in doing so, sorry, hopefully be able to teach others in their communities and schools as well. So this is a kind of second style that we did. So we actually created these posters. We put the pictures on the strip, and participants had to go around and write down what they were thinking. And I've just circled a few things. So you'll see enough is enough. And then you'll see that the thing it says, the answer isn't money, it's care, it's to care. And over here we see respect my boundaries and I'll take care of you. Now, I don't know if it was a young man or woman who wrote that, but you can see kind of a language of ecofeminism coming through this process, which we didn't particularly encourage. This is kind of what students came out from our information and then their own experiences. We then moved on to kind of strategy. You know, what are we going to do? So we know this thing is bad. We know that there's a system that's behind it. So what are we going to do? And we wanted to go back to history. So, you know, here's posters that they did on Chico Mendes. What were the victories? What were the tactics? What were the challenges they faced? And unfortunately, with Chico Mendes, you'll see Berta Caceres there from Honduras, and Sikosipi Radebe from Amatiba Crisis Committee. All three of them were murdered. So this is kind of a harsh reality that we kind of had to grapple with, is that the struggle is dangerous. You're taking on entrenched, powerful interests. And so it's hard, but kind of necessary. We followed this up with a camp at the end of the year, and we had a lot more participants from a lot more different movements in the Western Cape, but we still kept that core from the course. And the methods were similar, but also a bit different. And what we encouraged was a lot more debate, a lot more discussion amongst the different participants. Yeah, that guy in the white hat in the top left is Sipanati. He's actually participating, a good comrade of mine from Equal Education. And we also got into nature, and we did things like planting indigenous trees. We went into a hike and did some learning out there. And that's really important to break from the alienation to nature. I think everyone will kind of know what I mean when I say the majority of South Africans, despite living in one of the most beautiful countries in the world, are kind of denied access to nature. And all its benefits that it confers. So this is just a picture to represent what I thought was one of the biggest successes of the camp. And you can see Carolee there. She's standing there like a proud mom with her group. She wasn't involved in the play, but her group did a play and they got the first prize. They were also called the Hermione group, if you guys have ever read Harry Potter. But this play was simply incredible. And it actually gave real meaning to the word intersectionality, which people kind of love to talk about. But this play really gave it serious meaning. And it was a tragedy. It centered a family which was in poverty, a husband who drank, who was badly paid, who abuses his family, and the drought suddenly hits this family and it triggers off a spiral of crises that ends in a tragedy. And you know, Ayaka Melantafa, who's second on the left, she kind of contextualizes it at the end to say that nothing excuses the gender-based violence in our play. That's not what we're trying to say, but let's not pretend that the absolute material devastation of where we live in the townships don't have a huge role and underpin so many of the other challenges that we face and oppressions. And so it was a real success. This was a banner we did not tell them to make. This is a banner they made. Socialism is the cure, system change, not climate change. And we took it forward, and we've got a network group called Youth Against the System. We're trying to consolidate it, do some interesting things. We did a play at a protest at the waterfront. But unfortunately, COVID has taken its toll. And we had to adapt. And one of the things we've done at the AIDC is to start an online course about climate justice. So we've got quite a few short episodes to teach climate change. And we've been trying to share that over WhatsApp and get the word out. We have a platform where people can apply for data in case they don't have enough. And that's been a partial success. We're very happy with the podcast, but it's been difficult to share it. I think I've gone way over time, but let me just finish off with this.
Presidents, ministers, parliamentarians.
We say no to climate change.
We say yes to system change.
We say no to extinction.
We say yes to everlasting life.
Save our planet Earth and not destroy it.
Because there is no planet B.
Save our Earth. No deforestation, no burning coal,
no climate change.
Hashtag system change, not climate change.
Thanks, everyone.
Great. Thank you, Bruce. Thanks, everyone. I'll forgive you for putting photographs of me all over here. But I think what's really cool, right, with that is, so that last video was actually an exercise that we got all of the participants to do, where they had to make a video for social media in which they called on some sort of constituent to do something about climate change. And I think that whilst this is obviously a different kind of course to what happens in, the kind of courses we do in university, it doesn't have to be. There are ways in which we can incorporate a whole lot of these things into university teaching, into the kind of assignments we give. We don't have to just get people to write essays or answer multiple choice questions the entire time. So I think that that's really important. So what I'm going to do is cut some of the last exercises we have and just use the last bit of our time now to have questions and answers. So if anyone wants to raise their hand to say something, that would be important. I do see a question from Tsefo, so I'm going to read that out. This was directed to Michelle. It says, thanks for the presentation. Wondering how we can get the history of capitalist extraction and discussions on land into the so-called mainstream. As a lecturer at UCT, what do you think needs to happen, i.e. what are pragmatic or actionable ways to make this happen? So I think that's been a big thing. You know, we kind of all, I think, agree on a lot of aspects of this, but how do we sort of start to bring this into our curriculum? And please raise your hands or put questions here, but I'll hand over to Michelle to answer that.
Thanks. Yeah, that's a big question. But yeah, I think that first, we need more cross-departmental cross-departmental conversations. So as you know, I'm based in sociology, although economics is behind Leslie on the other side. We as departments, we don't really talk to each other. So these conversations need to happen across the sciences, the economics, and the humanities, and even within the humanities, because our entire humanities is completely Eurocentric. Not completely, we have exceptions, and I want to say that Chitonge is here from the Center for African Studies, and the Center for African Studies also launched the Koi and the San unit recently. So there needs to be one, more conversations. Two, we also need to, I guess, and this is very hard because many people are stuck in their disciplines and the way they've been taught. So when we have these conversations, we need to be open to kind of drop in what we think we know, or how we were taught. And I can't, and I think as a lecturer, as a newish lecturer at UCT, we as lecturers need to facilitate these conversations. And I want to just give you just a short example. UCT put out a call for sustainability projects at UCT, and myself from environmental humanities led a core group of interdisciplinary departments, including students that were from engineers, to put forward our proposal that's focused on relearning relationality on the soil and the land which UCT stands. And I think that when we have these conversations more openly without deterministic thinking, and I spend a lot of time in the left, and Bruce, including AIDC, is that often in the left terrains, there's quite a kind of deterministic way of thinking and approaches to how we solve problems. We have to kind of soften the approach to start drawing people in. So it's a big question, but that's the most I can do to begin the conversation to make these shifts. Thanks.
Thanks, Michelle. And I did see in the last session some people talking in the chat about that cross-departmental conversation and cross-university conversations and trying to share resources. And I think that's really important. Chitonge, would you like to come in also as someone who's working at UCT? This, someone who's based in the university, because I think we do have quite a lot of students on the call.
Yeah, so the challenge, of course, is that we think also, just apart from just cross disciplinary approaches, we need also to interrogate the paradigms from which we work, like history itself. If we think of history of any people, is often told from a particular angle, and I think that to promote a more diverse or rich approach to that, we need to begin to interrogate the paradigms from which we operate, and that's very difficult because people draw from what they've been trained, and this is the point that training is very crucial, because training can make people, and sometimes those images or those paradigms they stick with people for life. So if we're going to change things going forward, the way we train people will be very important. And particularly for those of us in Africa, the continent itself at large has been on the receiving end of information, whether it's about climate change or any new movement. So whether it's about economics, we're using a lot of ideas that have come from other places, and we never question whether these are relevant for us. when we talk of extractives, the continent has actually been violated for so many centuries in terms of, first of all, it was people and then resources. As we speak now, platinum is being shipped out of this continent, gold and diamond and all that, and the value that comes back is very small. So we need to begin to interrogate some of these at the broader level, and paradigms, I think, would matter a lot. Part of the problem is that we're still operating in a very Eurocentric paradigm, even in the teaching. Sometimes it's very difficult to convince university faculties and departments, we should admit that the ideas of decentering the Eurocentrism are a minority idea in any university, as far as I know. But that needs to change, because if we are going to make a difference, we need to deal with things at that level. Yeah. So that's a great question. I think that we can all, struggle with, students and teachers alike. Thanks.
Excellent, thank you. And I think it's important to note that our second session, so our afternoon slot tomorrow, is exactly about this. So our plenary session tomorrow is going to be about action towards changing the curriculum, and to really try to talk more concretely about how we change these institutions. So I think that's really important. Does anyone want to raise their hand now? We're coming close to the time, but I think we do have, if anyone wants to make any comments or ask any questions, you're really welcome to right now. Zamazimba, yes.
Hey. So so my question is directed to Bruce and you, Kali. So I see that you're doing a lot of work with regards to making sure that people are aware of the things that the environment is facing. So I would like to know, how can we make people interested in taking care of the environment? So that's my question.
Bruce, do you want to go first, and then I can come in?
Sure. So the question was, how can we make people care more about the environment?
Or more interested in taking care of the environment?
Yeah, I think there's maybe two things. The one thing which I think is quite powerful when we try and build a politics or a campaign or something around trying to protect the environment, is to point out how important the environment is to us, but also that the solutions to some of our issues are environmental solutions as well. So for example, public transport. Transport's one of the biggest issues that working people face. It's incredibly expensive, it's dangerous, it doesn't run on time. Well, actually, efficient, good public transport is one of the most important things in dealing with the climate crisis. I think we have to kind of try and at all times build collective organizing around these issues, because I do think it is difficult to, I'm certainly, when you ask this question, I presume you're talking about people who are generally isolated from the environment, who don't have access to nice green urban spaces, and it can be hard. It's hard to show people the environment, and when you're teaching the environment, sometimes people can't really relate necessarily to it. I take Michelle's point that we're part of nature. Nature is all around us, but when nature is so degraded, it's hard to sometimes realize that. But I think if you can organize ideas and campaigns around environmental justice, so kind of access to better parks, to kind of if you're in an area where you don't have access to good green space, to try and talk about that as like an issue to people. So, you know, where are our children meant to play? Where are we meant to go and relax and enjoy ourselves? You know, the environment around here has been destroyed, and that's a matter of injustice.
Yeah, I think that Bruce has really covered that well. I've just seen Seko's point in the chat where she said, I really like the comment that you made, Bruce, that a lot of South Africans have become estranged from the environment. It's really good framing since there's been a narrative by people, including Natras. So that is Nicoline Natras, who is a professor at UCT, that people actively don't care. And I think that really actually speaks to what Bruce has said, and it speaks to Michelle's point earlier about rethinking our relationship to nature, and that we are actually a part of nature. And as Bruce said, for some people that's very hard to relate to if you don't have access to it, if you don't think about it, especially and if you don't get to enjoy it. One of the things that we wrote about in our Just Recovery report, which I shared with a lot of you, is this idea by an academic called Mike Davis, who talks about public affluence. And this is this idea that really, in order to live a better life, and this talks about to a lot of the things we've spoken about here, about well-being, about happiness, to come to a better life, to live a better life and to really have well-being within our planetary limits, what we need is more public affluence. And that's about access to public parks, access to community gardens, and all of that. And that also speaks a little bit to what Michelle was raising earlier about not seeing renewables as just this, like, that we can just replace our current system with one that runs the same way but using renewables. Because what we're trying to do is limit what we take in an unsustainable way from the earth, while still having people live better lives. And I think that's possible to do. So I see that Bruce has a hand, and Michelle would also like to add. Bruce, did you say you wanted to add something? And then Michelle.
I just wanted to quickly say back to the first question by Checho about, you know, how can we get the history of capitalist extraction into the mainstream? And I think it's very important to recognize that even if you kind of manage to get more academics, more students talking about it at universities, that would be fantastic. But the only way you're going to get it into the mainstream is to kind of get outside of the academy, is to kind of be academics, be students that are organizing outside of the university as well. I think it can be like a trap into thinking that what happens in the university is necessarily going to transform into kind of what most people think about or accept. So yeah, I just wanted to touch on that.
Thanks, Bruce. That's great. And I think that especially Kia is going to talk about that tomorrow in tomorrow's session. Michelle?
Yeah, so I just like to understand, explain or add that. So I think part of the difficulty is that we see nature as something out there. Like when we take a walk in Table Mountain, then that's nature. But, you know, we drink water, we eat food, we live in homes that require wood and minerals. So for me, that's the kind of conversation. So when it comes to food, it's to understand that when we're cultivating food, we're not only cultivating for ourselves, but we're cultivating for the microbes, the earthworms, and we're creating cyclic processes. But our deep separation and alienation has you know, made us think whatever food's in the supermarket, or that the only way that you can grow food is through the, you know, mass industrial agriculture. So part of the conversation of rethinking our place in nature is to also understand that as humans, we have a fundamental role, and, you know, the relationships are symbiotic, and sometimes some things need disturbances. And I think to add is that what was erased from coloniality is the understanding that when we use nature's gifts, in a sense, it was always cyclic or life affirming, and it was dynamic. It wasn't this kind of way where we basically, you know, destroy things, take things out, and then use technology. So yeah, so it's a deep rethinking about these kind of relationships, and that, yeah, nature is not a walk in the in the, you know, in the mountains. So, yeah.
Great, thank you, Michelle. I think we're just about to finish in time for the thunderstorm that's about to hit me, so that's probably a good thing. I just heard the rolling thunder coming in. So I want to say thank you to everyone. I think it's been a really great opening day, and I really appreciate all of the engagement and the conversation. So we'll see you all back here tomorrow. The sessions are at the same time, so from 12 to 1:30, and then 2:30 until 4 will be the plenary session. So we'll have one more environment stream, and the speakers, I think, will be really great to take these conversations further, and I hope we'll also have a lot of time for discussion. So I think that that's really great, and I want to thank you all for that. If you have any comments overnight, please feel free to send me an email. If there's anything specific that you would like changed or anything about the session, please feel free to share that with me or any of the other hosts. We really welcome your feedback, and if anyone has any any resources they'd like to share, pop that in the Google Doc. Any questions or comments in there, we really welcome them. So thank you all very much. If anyone wants to say anything afterwards and stay on, please feel free to pop that in. And again, thank you very much to our speakers. We really appreciate you taking the time and preparing for this. It's really vital to the success of the day. So thank you. And we'll see you all tomorrow.
Thanks so much, organizers.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Bye.
Awesome. Bye. Thank you.
Thanks,
Bye.
everyone.
Thank you, everybody. Bye.
Bye-bye. Bye.
Bye.